Something strange happened the moment Alysa Liu stepped onto the ice in Milan. The judges saw it. The crowd felt it. Even her rivals noticed it. Because the skater standing there was not the same girl who quit figure skating at 16. And what she was about to do that night would quietly prove something the entire skating world had believed for years was wrong. But to understand why this routine shocked the sport, you have to go back to the moment Alysa Liu walked away from skating entirely. For a moment in Milan, the arena went completely quiet. Not the usual Olympic quiet. Not the nervous kind where people whisper and cameras zoom in on anxious faces. This was different. Alysa Liu stood at the center of the ice, shoulders relaxed, almost casual. No visible tension, no dramatic breathing exercises, no fixed stare at the judges' panel. If you didn't know who she was, you might have thought she was just another skater waiting her turn. But people who had followed figure skating for years knew something strange about this moment. Because Alysa Liu wasn't supposed to be here. Just 4 years earlier, the entire skating world believed her story was already finished, and it had ended in the most unexpected way possible. She walked away. Not after a scandal, not after an injury, not after losing. She quit after the Olympics. To understand why that shocked everyone, you have to go back a few years. Back to when Alysa Liu was still a teenager, and already rewriting the history of American figure skating. In January 2019, inside the Little Caesars Arena in Detroit, something happened that nobody expected. A 13-year-old girl stepped onto the ice at the US National Championships. 13. Most skaters that age are still competing in junior divisions, quietly building experience. Alysa Liu wasn't. She was competing against the best women in the country, and within minutes the arena realized they were witnessing something unusual. She landed a triple axel, one of the most difficult jumps in figure skating, not once, twice. If you follow skating even casually, you know how rare that is. For American women, the jump had almost disappeared from competition. Landing it once was impressive. Landing it twice in the same program and at 13 years old was something else entirely. By the end of the night, Alysa Liu had become the youngest US national champion in history. The record had stood for decades, and suddenly it belonged to a teenager who still had homework waiting at home. From that moment on, the skating world treated her like something special. Not just a promising athlete, a future Olympic champion. You could see it in the way commentators talked about her, in interviews, in headlines, in the quiet expectations that started surrounding her name. But expectations can be heavy, especially when they arrive before you're old enough to drive a car. Behind the scenes, Alysa's life looked very different from the smiling photos people saw online. Training sessions started before sunrise, 5 in the morning sometimes. School didn't happen in classrooms, it happened in the back seat of a car between practices. Travel, competitions, more training. Then repeat the cycle again the next day. It's a life many elite athletes understand. But there was something else about Alysa Liu's situation that made it more intense. Her father, Arthur Liu, had invested enormous resources into her career from the beginning. By some estimates, over $1 million had already gone into coaching, choreography, training time, and travel before she even reached her mid-teens. You can imagine what that kind of investment does to expectations. Nobody had to say it out loud, but it was always there. Every competition started carrying more weight. Every program mattered, every mistake became louder. Still, Alysa kept winning. In 2020, she defended her US national title, 2 championships before turning 15, and the narrative around her became even stronger. The prodigy, the future of American skating, the one who could finally bring Olympic gold back to the United States. But here's the part that many people didn't see at the time. Success was arriving faster than her ability to process it. Pressure does something strange when it builds slowly over years. You don't always notice the moment it becomes too much, it just accumulates. Training session after training session, competition after competition, expectation after expectation, until one day the thing you once loved starts to feel different. Alysa Liu reached the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics at just 16 years old. For most athletes, simply qualifying for the Olympics would be the highlight of a career. For her, it felt strangely different. She finished 6th overall, a respectable result for a teenage skater competing against some of the strongest athletes in the world. But internally, something had already shifted. Later, in interviews, Alysa admitted something that surprised many fans. She said she wasn't chasing a medal in Beijing. She was counting the days until it was over. Imagine that for a second. The Olympics, the dream event for athletes around the world, and a 16-year-old competitor quietly thinking about leaving the sport behind. Not because she failed, but because she was exhausted. A few weeks after the Olympic season ended, Alysa Liu made an announcement. Short, direct, almost calm. She was retiring from figure skating. At 16, no comeback plan, no break, just done. For the skating world, it felt like a story that had ended far too early. A prodigy who rose faster than anyone expected, and then disappeared just as quickly. At the time, most experts believed they had already seen the final chapter of Alysa Liu's career, but what nobody realized then was that her story was only halfway finished. When Alysa Liu retired in 2022, most people assumed it was temporary. That's usually how these stories go in elite sports. A young athlete burns out, steps away for a season, and eventually returns once the pressure fades. Commentators even said it openly on broadcasts. She'll be back. But weeks turned into months, and Alysa Liu didn't come back. In fact, she disappeared from the skating world almost completely. No competitions, no quiet training rumors, no comeback hints, just silence. Instead, something unusual happened. Alysa began doing things most elite skaters never have time to experience. Normal life. It sounds simple, but for someone who had spent most of her childhood inside ice rinks and airports, it was something entirely new. She enrolled at UCLA studying psychology. Suddenly her days weren't built around training schedules and competition calendars. They were built around lectures, group projects, and late-night conversations in dorm rooms. For the first time, people around her didn't see her as the prodigy. She was just Alysa, and that mattered more than many people realized, because when you spend years inside a sport that defines you completely, stepping outside it can feel strange at first, almost like removing a uniform you've worn your whole life. But slowly, something changed. Alysa started traveling, not the kind of travel athletes usually experience, flying into a city, seeing a rink, and leaving 2 days later. Real travel. At one point, she even joined a trip that took her near Everest Base Camp in Nepal. Imagine the contrast. For years, she had breathed the cold, recycled air of indoor skating rinks. Now she was standing thousands of meters above sea level, surrounded by mountains and thin Himalayan air. No judges, no scoreboards, no expectations, just the world. And somewhere during those months away from skating, Alysa began rediscovering something that had been missing for a long time: control over her own identity. In figure skating, appearance can quietly become part of the system. The sport has traditions, certain looks, certain costumes, certain expectations about how athletes present themselves. Alysa stepped away from that completely. She dyed her hair in bold raccoon-striped patterns. She experimented with piercings. Her style began to look less like classical ballet and more like alternative rock culture. Some long-time skating fans didn't quite understand it, but that was the point. For the first time in years, Alysa Liu wasn't trying to fit into a system. She was building her own version of who she wanted to be. And then something unexpected started happening. When you leave something behind for long enough, distance can change how you see it. During interviews later, Alysa explained that the break helped her realize something important. She didn't hate skating. She hated the pressure that surrounded it, the schedules, the expectations, the feeling that every performance defined her worth. Once that pressure disappeared, something else quietly returned. The feeling she had when she first stepped onto the ice as a child. Speed, freedom. The simple joy of gliding across frozen surface without thinking about scores or rankings. Early in 2024, almost 2 full years after retiring, Alysa did something very few people knew about at the time. She went to a rink, not a big training center, not an Olympic facility, just a quiet public rink. And she laced up her skates again. No cameras, no announcements, just curiosity. She stepped onto the ice to see what it would feel like, whether the connection was still there, whether the joy had disappeared, or simply been buried under years of expectation. The answer came quickly. Within minutes she felt it, the familiar glide, the sound of blades carving shallow lines across the surface, the adrenaline that only skating could create, and something else. For the first time in years she realized she could return to the sport on her own terms, not as the prodigy everyone expected, not as the future of American skating. Just as someone who genuinely loved being on the ice, that realization changed everything. But there was still one big question hanging over the entire idea. The skating world had already moved forward. New athletes had emerged. New champions had taken the spotlight. And when Alysa Liu finally announced she was returning to competition, many people weren't sure what to think. After all, 2 years away from elite training in figure skating is a very long time. Jumps disappear quickly. Timing fades. Confidence can vanish. Some analysts even suggested her comeback might be symbolic rather than competitive. A former prodigy, returning just to enjoy skating again. But what nobody realized yet was that Alysa Liu wasn't coming back just to skate. She was coming back to prove something, and the people who doubted her were about to discover something the entire sport had misunderstood for years. Because the Alysa Liu returning to the ice was not the same athlete who left it. When Alysa Liu officially announced her comeback in early 2024, the reaction across the skating world was cautious, not hostile, not dismissive, just skeptical. And honestly, you could understand why. Figure skating is one of the most unforgiving sports when it comes to time away. 2 years without elite training can change everything. Timing fades, jump technique deteriorates, confidence disappears faster than people realize. Many athletes never fully recover from even a single season off. Alysa had been gone for 2, so when the news broke that she planned to compete again, most analysts framed it the same way. A sentimental return, her talented former prodigy enjoying the sport again. Nothing more. Some commentators even hinted at it politely during early coverage. They talked about how refreshing it was to see her skating again, how inspiring it was. But rarely did anyone say the words Olympic contender. Not yet. Because the version of Alysa Liu people remembered was the teenage phenomenon from a few years earlier. The skater attempting quads and triple axels with explosive technical ambition. The sport had changed since then. New athletes had emerged. The technical arms race in women's skating had only intensified. And on paper, Alysa's comeback looked almost impossible. But something unusual started happening once she returned to competition. Her skating looked different. Not weaker, just different. If you watched closely, you noticed it almost immediately. The frantic energy that used to define her performances was gone. The pressure to land the hardest possible jumps in every program had disappeared. Instead, there was something calmer in the way she moved across the ice. Her programs weren't built around brute difficulty anymore. They were built around efficiency, cleaner landings, better flow between elements, more control in transitions. And strangely enough, that approach began working better than many people expected. Because while other skaters were pushing themselves toward the most dangerous technical content possible, Alysa focused on execution. Every jump landed with smooth glide out, every spin centered perfectly. Her step sequences carried a new kind of confidence, not the nervous determination of a prodigy trying to prove herself, but the relaxed rhythm of someone who genuinely enjoyed performing. You could see it on her face. She smiled more. Sometimes she even laughed after small mistakes. That might sound like a minor detail, but inside elite competition, it's extremely unusual. Most skaters treat mistakes like disasters. Alysa treated them like part of the experience. And gradually, people started noticing something else. She wasn't skating alone anymore. During earlier years of her career, Alysa had often looked isolated, the prodigy carrying enormous expectations by herself. Now there was a different energy around her. 2 names started appearing beside hers again and again, Amber Glenn and Isabeau Levito. All 3 were part of the new generation of American women's skating. And somewhere along the way, the media began referring to them with a nickname that sounded almost playful, the Blade Angels. They supported each other openly at competitions. They trained together. They celebrated each other's performances. For the first time in Alysa's career, skating didn't look like a lonely fight. It looked like a team. That support system changed the psychological equation completely, because pressure behaves differently when it's shared. Instead of carrying the weight of American expectations alone, Alysa became part of a group pushing each other forward. And slowly, results began following. First came solid performances in international competitions, then podium finishes, then something that made the skating world pause. At the World Championships, Alysa Liu didn't just perform well. She looked dangerous, not reckless. Dangerous in a different way. Calm athletes can sometimes be more threatening than aggressive ones because they're harder to break. Judges started rewarding her programs with higher component scores. Fans noticed the artistry. Commentators began adjusting their tone. The comeback story that once sounded sentimental started sounding serious. But the real turning point arrived during the Milano-Cortina Olympic Games in 2026. Before the individual event even began, the American team competed in the Olympic team competition, and something happened there that revealed how much Alysa had changed. During the medal ceremony after Team USA secured gold, the ribbon on Alysa's medal accidentally snapped. The medal fell and left a small dent. For many athletes, that moment would have been embarrassing. Alysa laughed. She literally laughed, picked up the dented medal, and joked that she liked it better that way. That reaction might seem small, but moments like that reveal a lot about someone's mindset. Because by the time the individual competition arrived in Milan, Alysa Liu was no longer skating like someone trying to reclaim a career. She was skating like someone who had already proven everything she needed to prove. And that psychological freedom was about to become her greatest advantage. Because the program she had prepared for the Olympic final was unlike anything the sport had seen in years. By the time the women's individual final arrived in Milan, the tension inside the arena was obvious. Olympic finals always carry pressure, but this one felt different. Several of the world's strongest skaters were competing that night. Japan had dominant athletes. Europe had technical powerhouses. And the American program, after more than 2 decades without an Olympic champion, was desperate for a breakthrough. For context, the last American woman to win Olympic gold in figure skating had been Sarah Hughes in 2002. 24 years, an entire generation of skaters had grown up in that shadow, and now Alysa Liu was stepping into that moment. But if you had watched her backstage just minutes before the performance, you might have been surprised. While some competitors were pacing quietly or focusing intensely with headphones on, Alysa looked relaxed. At one point, cameras caught her casually eating a bowl of udon noodles while chatting with her coaches about an anime series she had been watching. Not exactly the behavior people expect before an Olympic final, but that calmness had become part of her identity during the comeback. Pressure no longer controlled her. When her name was announced and she stepped onto the ice, the arena lights shifted and the first notes of her music began to echo through the rink. And the music choice alone surprised many people. Instead of the dramatic orchestral pieces typically used in Olympic programs, Alysa had chosen a Lady Gaga medley, including Edge of Glory and Applause. It felt bold, almost rebellious. Figure skating traditions tend to favor classical drama and emotional restraint. Gaga brought something different: energy, rhythm, attitude. From the first seconds of the program, it was clear this routine wasn't designed just to impress judges. It was designed to perform. The opening jump came quickly, clean landing, strong glide out. Then another element, and another. Technically, something interesting was happening. Alysa wasn't attempting the extreme quadruple jumps that had once pushed her body to the limit earlier in her career. Instead, she focused on precision. Triple jumps executed with perfect timing, smooth transitions, every landing flowing naturally into the next movement. In figure skating scoring, that kind of execution matters more than many casual viewers realize. Judges reward not only the difficulty of an element, but how cleanly it's performed. And Alysa's program was built to maximize that advantage. Her spins were centered almost perfectly. Her step sequence moved across the ice with intricate footwork that never looked rushed. But the most unusual part of the performance wasn't the technical side. It was what happened between the elements. Between jumps, Alysa interacted with the audience. A small smile, a glance toward the crowd. Moments of performance that felt more like a concert stage than a traditional skating routine. That connection created a different atmosphere inside the arena. Instead of the tense silence typical of Olympic finals, the crowd began responding to her energy. You could feel the mood shift. By the time the music reached the final chorus of Edge of Glory, something was happening that even commentators started noticing. Alysa Liu looked like she was having fun, not performing under pressure, actually enjoying the moment. That kind of freedom is extremely rare in Olympic competition because when athletes start worrying about results, their movements tighten. Mistakes happen. But Alysa had already faced the worst possible outcome years earlier when she quit the sport at 16. She had survived that moment, so skating in an Olympic final didn't carry the same fear anymore. The final spin ended, the music faded, and Alysa struck her closing pose. For a split second, the arena stayed silent. Then the reaction came. The crowd erupted. Even before the scores appeared, many people inside the building sensed what had just happened. Not necessarily because it was the most technically difficult program of the night, but because it felt complete, confident, human. When the score finally appeared on the massive screen above the rink, the numbers confirmed it. Alysa Liu had taken the lead, and suddenly the possibility that once seemed unrealistic started becoming real. If the remaining competitors failed to surpass that score, the prodigy who once walked away from the sport would become Olympic champion. And the entire skating world would have to reconsider everything it believed about success in the sport, because Alysa Liu hadn't won by pushing herself harder than everyone else. She had won by doing something much rarer. She chose her own path. And that decision was about to rewrite the final chapter of her story. When the final competitor finished skating in Milan, the arena fell into that familiar Olympic pause. Scoreboards take a few seconds. Judges calculate. Commentators start whispering possible outcomes. But inside the rink, everyone already sensed what was coming. Alysa Liu was sitting quietly near the boards with her coaches. No dramatic reactions, no visible tension, just calm conversation, like someone waiting for the result of a test she had already accepted. Then the numbers appeared, and in that moment, something historic happened. Alysa Liu had won Olympic gold. The first American woman to do it since Sarah Hughes in 2002. 24 years of waiting ended in a single routine. The arena exploded. Fans stood. Cameras rushed toward her. Teammates ran onto the ice. The American delegation started celebrating in the stands. For the United States skating program, the victory felt enormous. For years, the sport had been dominated by systems from other countries, Russia, Japan, and others that produced technically aggressive skaters at incredible speed. American athletes had remained competitive, but the Olympic title always seemed just out of reach. Until now. But the interesting part of Alysa Liu's victory wasn't just the medal itself, it was how she won it. Because she didn't win by following the model that had dominated women's skating for the previous decade. She didn't win by forcing the most dangerous jumps into her program. She didn't win by pushing her body beyond its limits. Instead, she won with something that looked almost simple from the outside: balance, clean execution, confidence. And perhaps most importantly, a completely different relationship with the sport. That change had started years earlier when she walked away at 16. At the time, many people interpreted her retirement as burnout, a prodigy who had reached the highest level too early and simply couldn't sustain the pressure. But the comeback told a different story. Walking away had given her perspective. It gave her a life outside the rink, college, friends, travel, moments where skating wasn't the center of everything. And when she eventually returned, she came back with a mindset that very few elite athletes ever managed to build. She understood that her identity didn't depend on the results anymore. That freedom changed the way she competed. You could see it clearly throughout the Olympic week. Other athletes carried visible tension. The stakes were enormous. Careers could change based on a single performance. Alysa approached the competition almost like a performer, stepping onto a stage. The medal ceremony later that night captured that difference perfectly. When Alysa stepped onto the podium and the American flag began rising behind her, the moment could have easily turned into a dramatic emotional scene, but her reaction stayed consistent with the attitude she had shown all week. Grateful, happy, but grounded. In interviews afterward, reporters asked her about the gold medal, about the history she had just made, and the pressure she had broken for American skating. Her answer surprised some people. She said the best part of the night wasn't the medal. It was celebrating with her friends afterward and going out to eat pizza. That might sound like a small comment, but it reveals something important about why her story resonated with so many people watching around the world. For decades, figure skating had often been portrayed as a sport of perfection, rigid expectations, carefully controlled athletes, programs designed to maximize scores above everything else. Alysa Liu's victory suggested a different possibility. That greatness could come from authenticity instead of pressure. That stepping away from a system doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it means returning stronger. Her performance in Milan quietly sent a message to younger athletes watching from training rinks around the world. You can chase excellence without losing yourself. You can leave when something stops feeling right. And if you choose to come back, it can be on your terms. The judges chose her program that night, but in many ways the real victory had happened long before the scores appeared on the screen. It happened the moment Alysa Liu realized she could skate again simply because she wanted to. That realization turned a former prodigy into something far more powerful, a champion who understood exactly why she was there. And as the lights slowly dimmed inside the Milan arena that night, one thing had become clear. Alysa Liu hadn't just proven the skating world wrong. She had changed what success in the sport could look like.